Okay, so you want to own a Formula One team. Blistering 220-mile-an-hour cars, champagne on the podium, your name attached to one of the most glamorous, most watched sports on the planet, broadcast to hundreds of millions of people across 20-something countries a year. You picture yourself in the paddock, sunglasses on, shaking hands with billionaires and movie stars while your car screams past the grandstand. That's the fantasy. Here's the actual business hiding underneath it. A sport that spent decades bankrupting its own participants through unlimited spending arms races, until the sport's own governing body was forced to impose an actual salary cap-style budget limit just to keep teams from bankrupting themselves competing for the same handful of championship points. An industry where a mid-pack team can lose tens of millions of dollars a year for over a decade, and where the same asset class has, in the space of about 10 years, gone from something wealthy enthusiasts, but as a passion project, to one of the single best-performing investments in all of professional sports. Some F1 team owners have made genuinely staggering fortunes. Others have gone bankrupt trying to compete in a sport where the difference between finishing 6th and finishing 10th in the championship can be worth tens of millions of dollars a year. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why Formula One team ownership looks nothing like the glamorous fantasy the broadcast package sells you, and why it's simultaneously become one of the hottest tickets in global sports investment. What you're actually buying before the money makes sense. You need to understand what a Formula One team actually is as a business, because it's a genuinely unusual hybrid that doesn't map cleanly onto any other sports franchise we've covered. Unlike a football or basketball team, an F1 team in just fielding athletes, it's operating what is functionally a specialized aerospace engineering company that happens to compete on race weekends. A modern F1 team designs and builds nearly every component of its car in-house: aerodynamics, chassis, suspension, and increasingly sophisticated hybrid power unit technology, employing hundreds of engineers, aerodynamicists, and technicians working essentially year-round on a program that gets almost entirely rebuilt every single season as regulations change and competitors improve. A team that finished near the back of the grid is not simply a poorly run version of the team at the front. It's often an organization with a fraction of the engineering headcount, a fraction of the wind tunnel time, and a fraction of the simulation computing power of the frontrunners, competing in a sport where aerodynamic and engineering sophistication translate almost directly into lap time. This is why F1 team ownership has historically been divided into two starkly different tiers. At the top sit the works teams, either owned outright by major automotive manufacturers like Mercedes and Ferrari, or backed by drink and beverage conglomerates like Red Bull. Organizations with billions of dollars in corporate resources and decades of accumulated technical infrastructure. At the bottom sit the independent, privately owned teams, competing with a fraction of the resources but bound by the exact same technical regulations and, since 2021, the exact same overall spending cap, a structural change that has genuinely reshaped the economics of the entire sport in ways we'll get into shortly. The cost of actually buying a 10 price of entry into this sport has exploded over the past decade in a way that has genuinely surprised even people who follow the sport closely. According to reporting on recent Formula One team transactions and public statements from Formula One's own commercial rights holder, a controlling stake in an established F1 team now commonly commands valuations well north of $1 billion, and the most valuable teams on the grid, the sport's genuine championship contenders with decades of accumulated brand equity, have been valued at $3 billion to over $6 billion in recent years according to Forbes' annual Formula One team valuations. This represents an almost unprecedented rate of appreciation for a professional sports asset class. According to those same Forbes valuations, several F1 teams have seen their franchise value increase by 50% or more in a single year during the sport's recent commercial boom, a pace of appreciation that rivals or exceeds anything seen in the NFL, NBA, or major European football over the same period. Even a struggling, backmarker team, one that regularly finished at the bottom of the championship standings, now commands a valuation in the hundreds of millions of dollars, purely because there are only 10 slots on the entire Formula One grid, a scarcity constraint enforced directly by the sport's own governing regulations, meaning owning any F1 team at all, regardless of on-track performance, buys you a share of a genuinely fixed supply global media property. This scarcity dynamic is the single most important structural fact in F1 team economics, and it explains almost everything else in this business. There will never be an 11th or 12th team diluting the value of the existing 10 without an extraordinarily difficult and expensive process, meaning every team on the grid, no matter how poorly it performs on Sunday afternoons, holds a permanent, defensible position inside one of the most exclusive clubs in professional sports. The budget cap revolution. To understand modern F1 team economics, you have to understand the single most consequential rule change in the sport's modern history. For decades, Formula One had no meaningful limit on what a team could spend building and developing its car, and the wealthiest manufacturer-backed teams spent staggeringly more than their independent competitors, sometimes multiple times more. In a pure arms race where outspending your rival was often more effective than out-engineering them, this created a sport that was, for large stretches of its history, genuinely uncompetitive at the level that mattered most, the championship, because a handful of teams with essentially unlimited manufacturer backing could simply spend their way to dominance regardless of how talented and underfunded rivals' engineers happened to be. Starting in the 2021 season, Formula One introduced a genuine cost cap, a hard limit on what a team can spend on car performance-related areas each season. And according to figures published by the FIA, the sport's governing body, that cap has been set at approximately $135 to $140 million per year for the current regulatory period, a figure that specifically excludes driver salaries, the top 3 highest-paid employees at each team, marketing costs, and certain other categories, but covers the core engineering and car development spending that used to be the primary battleground for outspending your rivals. This single regulatory change has fundamentally transformed the economics of team ownership. Before the cap, a wealthy manufacturer could simply outspend its way to competitiveness almost indefinitely, meaning the ceiling on what it costs to be genuinely competitive was effectively unlimited and unpredictable. After the cap, every team on the grid, from the wealthiest manufacturer operation to the most modest independent outfit, is legally required to spend within roughly the same envelope on car performance, which means the sport has become dramatically more competitive on track. Several genuinely different teams have won races and fought for championships in the years since the cap's introduction, something that would have been almost unthinkable during the unlimited spending era. And it has also made the financial performance of every team on the grid dramatically more predictable and, for the first time in the sport's history, genuinely profitable for well-run organizations, since teams are no longer required to match an essentially bottomless spending pit just to remain competitive, where the real money actually goes under the cost cap. Running a Formula One team is an enormously expensive undertaking, and the money is spread across categories that most fans watching a race broadcast never think about. The $135 million or so cost cap itself covers salaries for the engineering and technical staff, the raw materials and manufacturing costs for building car components, wind tunnel testing time, and the computational fluid dynamic simulation resources used to design and refine aerodynamic parts before they're ever physically built. Personnel costs consume a substantial share of that budget, since a competitive F1 team requires hundreds of specialized engineers, many of them among the most sought-after aerodynamicists and composite materials specialists in the world, commanding salaries that reflect just how scarce that specific expertise actually is. Power unit costs sit largely outside the cost cap for teams that purchase their engines from an external manufacturer, and this is a genuinely enormous line item, with independent teams typically paying tens of millions of dollars annually and thus to lease a competitive hybrid power unit from one of the handful of manufacturers, Mercedes, Ferrari, Honda, or Renault, that actually build them. Since designing and manufacturing a Formula One power unit from scratch is itself a billion-dollar-plus undertaking that only a small handful of major automotive manufacturers can justify. Driver salaries, explicitly excluded from the cost cap, represent another major and highly variable expense, and the gap here is genuinely enormous. According to widely reported figures across motorsport media, the sport's biggest stars, drivers with genuine championship-winning resumes and global marketability, can command salaries reportedly in the range of $50 million to over $60 million a year from the wealthiest teams, while a driver at a smaller independent team, particularly a younger driver still building their reputation, might earn a small fraction of that, sometimes even bringing sponsorship money to the team themselves, rather than commanding a salary at all. A practice known in the sport as a pay driver, though this has become considerably less common as the sport's overall financial health has improved. Then there's the travel and logistics cost of actually competing in a genuinely global championship. Over 20 race weekends spread across 5 continents each season, requiring teams to ship an enormous amount of specialized freight, spare cars, spare components, pit equipment, and hospitality infrastructure around the world on a punishing schedule, a logistics operation that sits outside the cost cap and can run into tens of millions of dollars annually for a team competing at the sport's current calendar length. How the money actually comes back. Formula One's revenue model has undergone a genuine transformation over the past decade, and understanding that transformation explains why team valuations have exploded the way they have. The single largest and most transformative revenue stream for every team on the grid is the prize money distributed by Formula One's commercial rights holder, and according to figures reported across motorsport financial media, this prize pool now totals well over $1 billion annually, distributed across the 10 teams based on a formula that weighs constructors' championship finishing position heavily, meaning a team's on-track competitive performance directly and substantially impacts its guaranteed annual revenue, creating a genuine incentive structure where climbing even a single position in the championship standings can be worth tens of millions of dollars in additional prize money the following year. On top of the shared prize pool, sponsorship revenue has become an enormous and increasingly sophisticated business in its own right, particularly since the sport's global viewership and cultural relevance surged following a widely credited Netflix documentary series that introduced the sport to a substantial new audience, particularly in the United States, a market Formula One had historically struggled to penetrate. Team sponsorship deals, the logos plastered across a car's bodywork and a driver's racing suit, can range from a few $1,000,000 for a smaller regional sponsor up to reportedly over $100 million annually for a team's title sponsor at the wealthiest, most successful organizations, and the number and value of these sponsorship deals has risen dramatically as the sport's audience has grown and diversified. Merchandise and fan engagement revenue, historically a modest afterthought for the sport, has become a genuinely meaningful business line as F1's audience has grown younger and more digitally engaged, with team-branded apparel, collaborations with fashion and lifestyle brands, and direct-to-consumer e-commerce operations building into real revenue streams that several teams now manage as dedicated business units rather than a minor side project. Finally, hospitality revenue, meaning the exclusive paddock club access, team-branded hospitality suites, and VIP race weekend experiences sold directly to corporate clients and wealthy fans, has become an increasingly significant profit center, particularly at marquee races like Monaco, Las Vegas, and Miami, where demand for genuine paddock access from wealthy fans and corporate clients considerably outstrips the very limited supply of available credentials. The volatility nobody wants to talk about despite the cost cap bringing genuine financial stability to the sport. Meaningful risk and volatility still exist in this business, and it shows up in ways that are genuinely unique to motorsport. The most obvious risk is simply competitive volatility itself, because prize money is so heavily tied to championship position. A team's revenue can swing by tens of millions of dollars from one season to the next based purely on where it finishes, meaning a team that has a genuinely difficult season, whether from a poorly performing car design, a major regulation change that catches their engineering department off guard, or simply a run of bad luck with reliability and crashes, can see its prize money income drop substantially the following year, right at the moment the team most needs resources to fund its recovery. Regulatory change represents a second, genuinely existential risk specific to this sport. Formula One periodically introduces major technical regulation overhauls, entirely new chassis and aerodynamic rules designed to reset the competitive order and prevent any single team from dominating indefinitely. And these regulation resets have historically been the moments where teams either surge dramatically up the grid or collapse dramatically down it, because a team's accumulated engineering knowledge and simulation tools built up under the old regulations can become substantially less valuable overnight when the fundamental technical rulebook changes. A team that correctly interprets a new regulation set can leap from the back of the grid to genuine championship contention within a season or two, while a team that misreads the new rules can fall from the front to the back with similar speed, a level of on-track volatility that has no real parallel in stick and ball sports, where a team's core roster and coaching philosophy don't get legislated out of existence by a rules committee every few years. Power unit supplier risk is a third, less obvious, but genuinely serious concern for independent teams, since a team that doesn't manufacture its own engine is fundamentally dependent on an external manufacturer's power unit performance and reliability, and a manufacturer's decision to reduce its F1 commitment or exit the sport entirely, something that has happened multiple times in the sport's history, can leave a customer team scrambling to secure a competitive engine supply deal on short notice, sometimes at considerably less favorable commercial terms than they previously enjoyed. The real case study, Manor and the backmarker death Spiralto. Understand how catastrophically this business could fail before the cost cap era brought stability. Look at what happened to Manor Racing, later known as Manor Grand Prix, a genuinely instructive cautionary tale from the years immediately preceding the current financial reforms. The team, which had entered the sport under a previous name with hopes of establishing itself as a viable independent operation, spent years competing at the very back of the Formula One grid, unable to match the engineering resources of the wealthier manufacturer-backed teams during an era when there was no spending limit constraining how much those wealthier rivals could invest in out-developing them. Chronically finishing at or near the bottom of the Constructors' Championship meant the team received a correspondingly small share of the sport's prize money pool, creating a genuinely vicious cycle. Insufficient prize money meant insufficient budget to hire top engineering talent or invest in competitive car development, which in turn meant continued poor on-track results, which in turn meant continued insufficient prize money the following year. The team entered administration, a form of insolvency proceeding, in early 2015, was rescued and continued competing, but ultimately collapsed permanently at the start of 2017 after failing to secure sufficient new investment to continue operating, becoming one of several Formula One teams during that unlimited spending era that simply could not sustain the gap between what it cost to remain on the grid at even a minimally competitive level and what the team's on-track results generated in actual revenue. Manor's collapse eliminated roughly 200 jobs at the team's factory, and the team's demise was widely cited within the sport as a key piece of evidence supporting the case for the cost cap that Formula One's governing body introduced a few years later, precisely because the unlimited spending era had created a structural trap where a backmarker team could do everything reasonably possible to manage its finances responsibly and still find itself in an unwinnable financial position purely because its wealthier rivals face no equivalent spending constraint at all. Manor's story is the clearest possible illustration of what Formula One team ownership looked like before the current reforms, And it's exactly the scenario the cost cap era has been specifically designed to prevent from recurring. Though, as we'll see in the two scenarios ahead, meaningful financial risk hasn't disappeared entirely. It's simply moved to different parts of the business. To scenarios, let's build the honest math the way an actual owner has to run it under the current cost cap regulations. In the good scenario, you own a well-run independent team that has steadily improved its competitive position over several seasons, currently finishing consistently in the top half of the 10-team championship standings. Your share of the prize money pool, based on that solid mid-table to upper mid-table finishing position, might run $80 million to $120 million annually. Layer on sponsorship revenue from a healthy roster of title, co-title, and secondary sponsors that has grown alongside the sport's expanding global audience. Potentially another $100 million to $150 million annually for a well-marketed, competitive team. Add hospitality and merchandise revenue that has grown into a genuine business line, another $20 million to $40 million, against total revenue in the range of $200 million to $300 million annually. Your cost cap constrained car development spending is fixed at roughly $135 million. Your power unit lease, driver salaries, and logistics costs might add another $80 million to $120 million outside the cap, leaving a genuinely healthy operating profit margin for a well-run organization, a dramatic reversal from the chronic losses that define this business for most independent teams during the unlimited spending era. Now the harder scenario. You own a team that has struggled to translate its resources into consistent on-track performance, finishing near the bottom of the championship standings despite operating right up against the cost cap ceiling, thus like everyone else. Your prize money share, tied heavily to that poor finishing position, might be less than half of what the front-running teams receive, perhaps $40 million to $60 million annually. Your sponsorship revenue suffers correspondingly, since sponsors generally pay a meaningful premium for association with a winning, camera time heavy team, and a backmarker car simply doesn't deliver the same brand exposure value, leaving you with perhaps $30 million to $50 million in sponsorship income instead of the $100 million plus a front-running team commands. You're still required to spend close to the full $135 million cost cap on car development just to remain minimally competitive and avoid falling even further behind, plus a similar external cost burden for power units, drivers, and logistics as your better-performing rivals. The gap between these two scenarios, even under a cost cap specifically designed to level the financial playing field, can still be the difference between a genuinely profitable, appreciating sports franchise and a team operating at a persistent, though survivable, financial loss. The crucial difference from the pre-cap era being that the losses are now bounded and predictable rather than an open-ended spending war with no ceiling in sight. The real payoff. The difference between Formula One team owners who build lasting wealth in this business and those who struggle ain't really about who spends the most anymore, because the cost cap has specifically leveled that particular playing field for the first time in the sport's modern history. It comes down to engineering efficiency within a fixed budget, meaning extracting more competitive performance per dollar spent than your rivals. Since every team is now working within essentially the same financial envelope on car development, it comes down to building a commercially compelling brand that attracts premium sponsorship regardless of exactly where you finish in the championship. Since teams with a genuinely engaging story, a beloved driver lineup, or a distinctive brand identity have proven capable of commanding sponsorship revenue disproportionate to their pure on-track results, and it comes down to simply owning one of the 10 permanent, scarce slots on the grid at all. Since the fixed supply nature of Formula One team ownership means every team on the grid has captured a meaningful, appreciating asset purely by holding its position, regardless of short-term competitive struggles, a dynamic that has driven the sport's team valuations to levels that would have seemed genuinely absurd a decade ago. The romance of the paddock, the champagne, the global glamour, is entirely real, and increasingly, so is the money behind it. in a way that simply wasn't true for most of this sport's history. Which means the honest answer to whether owning a Formula One team can make you rich is yes, more reliably and more predictably than at almost any previous point in the sport's history. Thanks to a regulatory reform specifically designed to fix the sport's own broken economics. But the owners who build the most lasting wealth are still the ones who understand that in a sport where every team now has essentially the same budget to work with, the real competitive advantage has shifted from who can spend the most to who can think the most clearly within an identical set of financial constraints, on a grid where all 10 seats are permanently, structurally valuable, whether the car sitting in them is winning on Sunday or not. And subscribe.